Of all the terrible things that happened in Christchurch, New Zealand this past week, it's the videos that have been getting to me. You know the story, right? Someone took a portable camera and strapped it to his helmet as he entered a mosque and began shooting indiscriminately. People gathered in worship and prayer. He killed 49, a little 3-year-old boy who was running toward him. He shot him too. And that camera was recording the videos and streaming them live onto the internet. And that's the thing that's been getting me. And actually, even the fact that that's the thing that gets me bothers me. Because it worries me how I'm becoming numb to senseless tragedies like this. And maybe you share that with me too. It feels like we've had a lot of this. When hatred shows itself, reveals its presence, when people show their disdain for humanity, when there are these terrible, unthinkable tragedies, whether in schools or mosques or synagogues or churches or just in a neighborhood, there have been an awful lot of things, and I worry that I'm getting numb, and that bothers me. But this time around, these videos have been really irritating me. They've been really rubbing me the wrong way. Because as this alleged shooter took this camera and strapped it to his helmet and went in, he was live streaming it so that people could join him and watch this happen live. And Facebook tells us there were at least 200 people who watched this, who were following along as he went into that mosque, and not one of them said anything to any authorities or let Facebook know. In fact, Facebook was only notified that these videos were being published to their website 12 minutes after the whole thing was done. And what they've told us is that in those 12 minutes, at least 4,000 people had watched those videos. When they went to take them down, they found that they had been posted and reposted 1.2 million times. Now, what that means is that at least 200 people thought that this was entertaining and worthwhile way to spend their time, to watch this happen live. And at least 4,000 people thought that seeing this video of an indiscriminate slaughter was worth their time. And at least 1.2 million times, minimum, people thought this is something to share. This is something that people should see. And I worry about what that says about us. I worry about what that says about us as humanity, about how we use technology and entertainment. I worry about what that says about how we see others. Even if New Zealand feels a long way away, those are human beings. And what does that mean of us? Because we share the same world. It's the same soup we swim in. What does that say about us, too? It's not anything good, is it? Now, this has happened enough that we know what happens next, right? Whenever we have a tragedy that someone has done, we always want to try to find the reason why. And we see that happening with our news and with the media. We always go and we interview and find out, well, what was their home life like? What was school like? What were their hobbies? How did they spend their time? Work, etc., and so forth. What we're doing is we're trying to find a reason why. We're trying to find some handle on the situation that we can point to and say, oh, look at that. Isn't that terrible? This is why this person is so broken, and look at what they did to this person, and then it gives us a handle because we've got somebody that we can blame. The problem is that same impulse that says this person and that group is somehow less valuable or less than others is the same impulse that caused 200 people to watch live and 4,000 people to watch the recording and 1.2 million postings onto Facebook, because it says they are worth less. And every time we think that someone is less, that is a sin. Every time. And it's in all of us. It's the soup we swim in. That same impulse infects us all. It's that brought the people to Jesus this morning in that gospel. The same thing. Jesus is in the midst of a teaching tour as he's on his way to Jerusalem. And on this particular day, as he's teaching, the people come up to him and they want to share with him the local news. And then, as now, the tragedies are the ones that we share because they're the ones we remember and they're the ones that are compelling. And so the people bring him the local tragedies. Hey, Jesus, did you hear what happened? Pilate. And yes, that's the same Pilate we're going to hear from on coming up in Holy Week. It's the same Pilate. Pilate slaughtered, executed some folks from Galilee, the northern part of Israel. And then Pilate took their blood from the execution and mixed it in with the sacrifices that they were offering to God. Isn't that awful, Jesus? Boy, they must have done something really terrible to deserve that, right, Jesus? They must be awful sinners, right, Jesus? Because everything happens for a reason, right, Jesus? And Jesus shakes his head. I think sadly, shakes his head. And I hope lovingly shakes his head. Because Jesus knows that this way of seeing the world is killing us. This framework in which we see things, wanting to blame people, it's killing us. It may be natural for us, but it's tearing us apart. And after all, Jesus here is on his way to Jerusalem. Jesus is on this teaching tour, making his way to the city of Jerusalem, where he'll be welcomed, but then the same crowd will turn, and they will be the ones pointing to him and blaming him. It's his own fault for being arrested by the Romans. It's his own fault for being betrayed by his followers. It's his own fault for being put on trial. It's his own fault for being beaten and dragged outside of the city, and it's his own fault for being killed in the most gruesome way they knew how, the most public of executions. It must be his fault, and Jesus knows it will be our voices coming up in just a couple weeks. You see, when we read Scripture, when we listen to what the prophets say, when we see Jesus on his way to the cross for us, as we gather there and watch this, what love really looks like, what we realize and we recognize is that God never says bad things are not going to happen. The Israelites go into the desert. There's no water. The Galileans get killed. People get crushed by the Tower of Siloam. The kids don't call. It's hard. We have difficulty getting pregnant. We lose loved ones. Terrible things happen in this world, and God has never promised that they won't. Nor has God said that somehow the bad things we encounter are part of a grand master plan to redeem the universe. Because that puts us in far too much control that we don't have. What God says is, when you're in the desert, I'm there. When you're in the wilderness, I'm there. When things fall apart, I'm there. When the storms hit, I'm there. I will always be there, God says. Our image today is that God is a rock. And then when the life comes storming all around us, that's what we need most, right? A rock we can hold on to, a rock we can cling to, a rock we can build our life on. You remember when Jesus talked about two people who were building houses, one was on sand and one was on rock, and you remember which one went well? The rock. We need a foundation to build the kind of life that God intends for us to do. And God is that rock for us. God will always be there, but it's even better than that. Because if God is a rock that looks like that, we have to run to God, but God is going to come hopping along behind us. God is there for us in the middle of the storm. Whatever that storm is, whenever things fall apart, God is there. And in the midst of when everything falls apart, God is there. And God will be at work there. So God is our rock and our foundation so that we can be what God intends us to be, producing the fruits of living in God's presence and God's care. But it gets better than that. It's even better than that. One of my favorite lines of Scripture is there at the end of Isaiah that we heard just a moment ago, when God, speaking through the prophet, says, "My ways are not your ways, and my thoughts are not your thoughts. I am not like you," God says. And isn't that great news? God is not a better version of us with all the limits that we have. God is not some spiffed up version of being human. God is different than we are, and that means that our God, who is the rock and there with us when things fall apart and in the middle of every storm, God is going to be doing things we cannot imagine. God says, I have creativity you can't even imagine, and blessings you would never come up with. And I can do things in the midst of when the world falls apart. That will change you forever. God is our rock in the midst of the storm. And we know that because of the cross. The cross right here behind me, this symbol is a sign of God going into the worst of the world. There is not a moment or a time, there is nothing that can happen where God is not there. And God, whose ways are not like ours, whose thoughts are not like ours, whose blessings and whose work in the midst of really terrible things, God is there. For God is our rock, and our invitation is to build ourselves on Him, God who is always